So we're going to create a rubric for an assignment in Brightspace. I'm looking currently at a master site, and this subject has two assessments that are going to need rubrics. So I'm going to make the rubric for this report, assessment 2, and I'm going to start by getting a hold of the subject outline for this particular subject. And I can see, looking at the outline, which I've got here, if I go down to the task area where we outline the rubric requirements for assessment 2, if we go down to marking criteria and standards, right, so there's the information for my rubric, and I can see that there are 1, 2, 3, 4 criterion, and they add up to 50. So the marks are identified here, and here are our criterion scale descriptors. So that's what I've got to work with at the moment, and I'm going to be copying and pasting the information straight from there into the rubric tool in Brightspace. So I'll move that off screen. Currently these assignments don't have rubrics to attach, so I'll start by going into the subject admin area. And underneath assessment, I can find my rubric collection. Now, building this inside the master site is fine. In fact, it's better than fine, it's ideal, because each time the subject is provisioned at week -4 into a new session subject site, the rubrics, the assessment information, the content, etc. will all be copied across. So I'll do this once and then I won't have to do it again unless I'm updating the rubric. So let's open the rubric tool. There's currently none in the rubric library for this subject. So we'll create a new rubric. And I want it to be fairly easily identifiable. So at the moment, this is made for assessment 2. The text type is a report. Maybe I'll just put in rubric. It's important to draw your attention up here to the top right-hand corner. The status for a rubric must always be set to published if you want to be able to access and attach this to an assignment or any assessment. The other statuses you can have are archived and draft, but effectively if you want to be able to use it live with an assessment, you're going to need it to be set to published. So if it ever doesn't say published, change the status to published. That will happen if you copy a rubric, for example. It'll change it to draft, so you'll need to switch it to published. It does auto-save as well as we go along. There's no save button, so that's good. Let's look at our options here. Type. In Brightspace, you've got two types of rubric, holistic and an analytic. Holistic is effectively a single criterion rubric. Analytic, if you've got more than one criterion, you're going to need to use an analytic rubric. That's it, basically. And given that when you're looking at each of the criterion that are created by default, you can, in fact, delete any superfluous rows, for example, using a holistic rubric is not really necessary. You could always just delete any excess rows. So, type analytic. The scoring that we're going to use here, because this is a quantitative rubric, it's going to tally the marks as a part of selecting different criterion scales. So we're going to be looking at either points or custom points. The difference being points will allow us to identify one value for all criterion that achieve a particular scale. That's not much good to me because we have different values for each criterion. So I'm going to change this to custom points. Now, if you're using a qualitative rubric, which provides an indication to the students of where their achievement sits without giving them scores or tallying for you, then you would choose no score. But for this exercise, we're going to go custom points. And you'll see now that I have the ability to identify what the starting value is for each of these criterion scale areas. Right, so this is ready for me, but I've only got 4 columns. We use 5 if we're sticking with our HD through to fail areas. So I'm now going to just populate each of these scale columns. So this is going to be distinction, credit, pass, and fail. You can provide percentages, etc. against each of these if you like, but it's just text. This has no impact on scoring in those headings. So I'll just populate that now. Okay, so we've got our percentages in there. And now what I'll need to do is to take the criterion descriptors from the subject outline that I was looking at before. So I can just left click and drag on the subject outline, Control C to copy, and now I can paste those in underneath. So we've got criterion 1, and I would leave those headings in there. There is a text limit, so you're not going to be able to have massive descriptors for your criterion. If they're relatively concise, you won't have any problems. But if they're starting to go down more than, say, a page of scrolling, etc., you'll find that there's a cutoff point and you'll need to paraphrase. So let's put that in for each of the criterion areas. So there's number 2. Grab number 3, which is here. And I've got one more, which means I've got to add an additional criterion. Here's the option there. This will be criterion 4. And we will take that from here, which is simply the word presentation apparently. So we'll take that from here as well. All right, so now we have each of our criterion descriptors in place. Now we have to populate the information for each of the scale descriptors against each criterion. So I'll go to the first one and copy that from subject outline. So here's the first one for HD for criterion 1. Okay, copy and paste. This will actually take a lot more text than the actual descriptor will itself, so you won't have any problems with limits there. So that's been done, and I'm going to do the same thing for each of the criterion descriptors now for the rest of the rubric. Okay, so we've populated each of the scale descriptors against each of the criterion, copied and pasted them directly from the subject outline. So we're almost done with the rubric creation process, but now importantly for a points-based rubric we have to determine what these starting values are for our marking. So there's a couple of important rules here. The most important being that your HD value must always be the maximum for that particular criterion. So in this case the first criterion is worth 10. So you can either put 10 over here on the left hand side, and you'll notice as soon as you do that it stretches out. It has an attempt at trying to evenly divide each of these values, but this is probably not going to work for you in some ways. You can see that these values are just not going to match up necessarily, 2.5, etc. So it does importantly max out the HD column, which you have to leave in place. And I would suggest, given that in the marking with a custom points rubric, you can adjust each of the individual marks as you're going through the marking process. This is just a starting point when your markers are tallying. So that means given that we're already starting with the max value in the first column, I don't think it's a bad practice to do that as your starting point for each of the values here. That way you can instruct your markers to simply adjust down when they're selecting each of these scales if they think that it doesn't meet the requirement necessarily for, in this instance, a value like 8.4. So we've got 10 out of 10 marks. This one then, if it's going to be the top, will be 8.4. The next one will be 7.4. Then this one will be 6.4. And this one will be 4.9. And your markers are not stuck with this mark. It's simply a starting point, and they can adjust down and make that value whatever they like as part of the marking process. So I'm going to now go through and put in those values for each of the 4 criterion for this task. So I've now finished putting in the values for each of my starting positions for each of my criterion scale point values. So that's done. And if I scroll to the bottom underneath my criterion descriptor area, I can see that the rubric now tallies out of 50, which is great. That's what I'm looking for. So we'll keep moving through the rubric creation process. And what I can see here is an area called overall score. Now I find this quite misleading in some ways for students, because the overall score for a student is actually the weighting of the task, and Brightspace will provide that information to them. For me, creating a points-based rubric or a scoring rubric, I need this for tallying for my markers, not necessarily to give the numbered information on the rubric values directly to the students as part of their feedback. So really, they're going to get an overall score from Brightspace against their assessment task, not from this rubric area, which is still talking about levels and other numbers. Basically, I don't think I need it. So what I'm going to do is, in fact, delete each of these overall score column areas, because I want them to be focusing on the mark that Brightspace gives them for the task and the value that whether that's a HD through to a fail, etc. I don't want them looking at the rubric and potentially having inconsistency between the rubric's overall score value down here and the task weighting score. The last one, it won't let me delete the final area, so I'm just going to call this not applicable. So anything that comes up with a mark of 1 or more here is just going to say NA underneath. They're going to get a rubric score, they're going to get a task weighting, so that's fine. I'll leave this alone now. Another thing to keep in mind, you may be interested in Brightspace rubrics having pre-populated initial feedback underneath each of your criterion scale descriptors. So if you want the HD area for criterion 4 to have some initial feedback already in place for students, pre-populated, you can put that in here. I guess have a think about how that might play out for your markers. If there's information you want them to provide by default to all students, it can be put in here into the rubric itself and then they won't have to type it. But it's going to be in place every time you select that particular value. So pre-populated feedback as part of each of the scale criterion descriptor areas. All right, so we've fixed our overall score area. The last thing we need to do with our rubric creation is to look at this options area. The first thing it's asking us is about visibility. Do we want the rubric to be visible to students? What this means is actually in the assignment description area, do you want them to have to scroll through the rubric information as a part of submitting the assignment and reading the description for the assignment? I'm going to take the position here that that information is available to the students in the subject outline, and I want them to be looking at that document for information on the task. So I'm actually going to hide the rubric until I'm ready for them to get that as part of their feedback, because again, they can get it from the subject outline rather than just creating more scrolling inside the system. So I'm going to hide it until their feedback has been published. And the next question we have is around score visibility. Do I want the students looking at whether or not they get 7.45 for a particular criterion in the rubric, or do I want them concentrating on the value that they're getting, a distinction, a credit for a particular criterion, and looking at my feedback? I'm going to take the position at this point that I don't want them looking at the numbers within the rubric. I want them looking at the information that's in there, not the scores. So I'm going to hide the scores from the students. The description's not visible to students, so I'm going to leave that alone. And lastly, this area around new associations. We don't have these tools turned on currently in Brightspace, so I'm going to leave those alone. I don't care about them. It has auto-saved as I've gone through this process, so I'm going to hit close. So my rubric is published. It's ready to be used. It's been clearly labelled with the task number, the text type, and it's ready to be attached to whichever assessments I want to use this rubric with. I can also duplicate it if I wanted to use it again and modify it for something else. But for the moment, I'm going to go back into my assignment area and I'm going to attach this rubric to this particular assessment. So let's edit assignment 2. We'll open up evaluation and feedback because this is where the rubric area lives, and I'm going to add the rubric for this task. It is an existing rubric, and there it is in the list. Because it's been published, it means I can attach it. You also have the option here of opening up the rubric via a preview. So you can see what it looks like when your markers will be going through, and I can see here descriptor, each of the scales, the point values, etc. The students are not going to get those points, they're not going to be able to see those, but the rubric is good to go. I could print a copy out if I wanted to, and then going back, I'm going to finish the process of adding this rubric to this task. So that's now been done. If I hit save and close, in this instance I have a rubric attached to an assignment shell in the master site, and that will be provisioned every time the subject is rolled out. So that's how we create a points-based rubric in Brightspace.